Good morning. So we continue. Yesterday, we began an introduction and the beginning of Hemshech Tafrei Samach Vav, Hemshech Samach Vav, as it's called. And we'll continue. As is the custom in this class, I always sum up what we learned in the previous class and then continue inside the text-based Samach Vav. The text, if you want to follow along, can be found both at samachvav.com and that WhatsApp group. If you haven't joined the WhatsApp group, which is a group about Samach Vav in this class, different details of their schedule changes or discussions about the themes or general links and other sources. So please join the WhatsApp group by either chatting here on the Zoom or sending an email contacting us, Meaningful Life Center, or Isaac Yitzchak Wiener, who's on the class. So, with that, we began the Hemshech with a question on the Maimer Chazal, on the Mishnah that says that you don't blow shofar when Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbos. The Rabbah made a gzera because those that are not familiar with the laws of those that are not familiar with the laws may desecrate Shabbos because they'll carry the shofar to ask an expert. And the obvious big question, which goes back already to the Alter Rebbe, who asked the question, the Samach Vav cites that question. What does that mean? Shofar is a mitzvah sesa d'oraisa. It's a mitzvah from the Torah. The gzera is only the Rabbanan. Rabbah made the gzera. And it's only not for everyone. It's not for tzaddikim, or like he called it, tzaddikim, g'delim, v'tevim. So how could you deprive a mitzvah from so many people, or definitely from the righteous people, because there's some that may not know the difference or may not be familiar with these laws. Like he said, not bikim in the Tekiyah Shofar, and therefore go to the baki, to the expert, and they may carry on Shabbos. And especially considering that Shofar is such a central mitzvah in the month of Tishrei, and a central mitzvah in general that mizmamshich from Pnimius and Atzmos Ein Sof. So that's the standing and operative question, which will be answered later in the Hemshech, as is the custom in these types of Maimorim. The answers I usually come at the end of a Maimor. Here it comes later in the Hemshech, not all the way at the end, but later, as we shall learn at the time we get there. So to begin, the classic style of Chassidus is you discuss what is shofar in the first place. Before we talk about shofar on Shabbos, which is a practical application, of course, of a mitzvah, but what is shofar? So he says shofar is tshuva. And that's the reason that Tkiyah Rishena, the first sound of the shofar, is a koil poshet. It's a seamless, shapeless sound without any breaks, reflecting the shapeless call, the pure, shapeless call from the depths of a person's soul, which is the essence of tshuva. Yeseridus v'spilus pnimi shebenefesh, a awakening, a stimulation that comes from the inner part of the soul that is revealed in a kol posha dafka, in a very shapeless voice, sound, I should say. Now, to appreciate that, he goes back, let's see, where else do we find an emotional expression in addition to tshuva, which is shofar? So he brings that there's another form of an internal emotional arousal, which is the longing called Re'usa deliba, the desire in the heart to cling and to cleave to godliness. The difference between the two, however, is critical to understand what shofar and tshuva is in contrast to Re'usa deliba. And he says two main differences. Well, it's one main difference that breaks into two parts. That Re'usa deliba is b'chinas kiruv, and in two ways. One is due to the sense you feel something. You feel close to something, so you want more of it. So you want to be even closer. So both the feeling is as a result of kiruv, of a sense of closeness, and the desire is one of closeness, of becoming entirely encompassed in that connection. The second, whereas in tshuva, it's the opposite, besides richuk. you feel the distance. You feel a certain distress. And that is what causes you to want to return and connect to Elokus. And this difference will also be reflected in the two elements, that one is in silence, like the Kohanim. Re'usa Deliba is silent, and Shofar, Teshuva, is with a sound, which we'll soon learn about more. So that sums up where we reached in the difference between the two levels of this Esedus Pnimi, one coming from Kiruv, it's not because you're feeling something, rather it's because you feel actually that you're not feeling, and you're distressed over the fact that you sense distance. So he said there's a hergesh of Elokus there, obviously. It's not a person who's numb. He's definitely feeling, but it's feeling more the distance, how he has, he's distressed and he's disturbed and it's bitter for him, the fact that he's distant. But he doesn't feel the hafla, the awe of Ein Sof, of the divine, as in Re'usa Deliba. The hafla of ha'ili u'mezeu spailas nafshe. Ki ma shenigei me'ed be'imek levove harichuk. Mizen nasa spailas. He feels in the depths of his heart the distance, and that's what causes him to be stimulated. So it's two very different ways how a person can be essentially awakened. One is you feel something and you want more of it. Another is you feel the opposite. You feel the distance, and therefore you want to connect. And that's where we stopped. The line that begins Be'emek Levove on page Beis, second page of Samach Vav. And we'll continue reading from there. It's around, let's see, 9 lines from the top, I believe. So let's continue. As I said, the text can be found in the PDF on samachvav.com. I think it was also posted on our WhatsApp group. So right now we're talking about rotze. Rotze means a yearning, a longing. Like think of a flame reaching upward. In this case, the soul transcending and reaching upward. There are two different reasons it can reach upward, like we just said, kiruv or richuk, from close or from distance. But he's saying now, in this ispilus that comes from distance, there's also hamshacha. And he says it in Yiddish, in my Marim, when they bring something in parentheses or they say it in the Yiddish, is because the Yiddish has a certain touch and feel to it that's not quite able to be expressed fully in the Hebrew. So he says that tzion zich. Tzion in Hebrew means the meshicha. In Yiddish means meshicha, means longing. It means being drawn to. But it's a word in Yiddish. Tzion has a particular feeling to it. That tzion zich. V'harotze le'elokus. And the longing, rotze, to godliness. So, so this richuk, this sensing a distance, has gamken hamshacha, the tzion zich, v'harotze le'elokus. So he said before that it has a hergesh aliki, but it's not coming from feeling the awe and the what do we call it, the magnificence of godliness, but rather it's coming from distance. Now he's saying here there's also a tzion. There is a being drawn to it. However, avol inyane eine inyan akiruv. So let's just distinguish. He's not repeating what he said before. Before he was saying that this distance, this feeling of distance, is also what he called a hergesh alakus. He's sensing godliness, that's why he feels distant from it. If a person didn't feel godliness altogether, then there would be there wouldn't be any longing. That's the first thing he said. Now he's going further, that you're actually being drawn to godliness. Not just you feel godliness and you feel distance, you're being drawn. So then the question is, isn't that the same idea of kiruv, of the Re'usa Deliba, which is also you feel closeness and therefore you're drawn to it? So he says, no, but it's in Yoni Ein Inyan Kiruv. This being drawn to godliness in Teshuva and Shofar is not the inyan of kiruv. It's not about coming close. Here the desire by Teshuva and Shuvah is not the desire to become encompassed in the source. In the first state, this is a little more subtle difference. In the Re'usa Deliba, because you feel close, so you want to be even closer. You want to become encompassed completely. Here, because you feel distant, you want to become mukuriv, you want to feel close. It's not about like being encompassed in the source itself. That's Re'usa Deliba. Here's mukuriv l'elikus hana shalei yeh b'mokem harichuk. In other words, your main focus here is that you shouldn't feel distant. I gave an example yesterday, which also comes from language of recovery and healing, that there are two ways a person can be stimulated, can be inspired to heal. One is you see something that you really desire, you see it's very powerful, and it draws you, and you want to become part of it. Another, you feel your life is falling apart, God forbid. Or think of a burning building. The reason you're running from the building, the reason you're rushing, and there's a deep longing is not because where you want to end up, it's because where you are is so distant. So running from a burning building is very different than someone who sees a beautiful mansion and wants to visit it, or wants to enter there. And that's the difference. So both of them, yes, are longing for godliness, but one is already in a sense where they're already feeling the closeness, and they want to now be encompassed, become part of it. Like you said, muvukish likolo, to be encompassed. This one, however, is to not feel, to get away from the distance. So it's primarily coming from sensing the distance, which in turn, of course, means you want to get out of the burning building. So you see when people, for example, when they are challenged in life with any particular area, sometimes it's because they see how bad it got. That's why they motivates them to want to get better. And another situation, the first scenario is as being driven from the good, not necessarily running from a burning building, not necessarily running from a destructive or dire circumstance. V'hurak, the Rebbe Rashab adds now, and this second level, where you're running from getting away from being distant, it's not about being encompassed in the godliness itself. So what is it? What does it entail? It is, at the end of the day, it is being drawn to godliness. But what does it entail? He says it's only the commitment and the dedication, the sina mesida, that he commits and gives himself to godliness, and to fulfill God's desire. It's very different than saying, I become one with him, that I become encompassed within him. That's a higher level relative. Higher, I don't want to get higher or lower because each of them have something the other doesn't have, but it's a different level. Okay, so that's how he explains these two types of being drawn to the transcendent godliness. And now he's going to go back to explain why one is therefore silent and one is with sound. But let me stop here if anybody wants any clarification on the points that we reviewed now, that I added now, what we learned inside. If anybody has any questions. Okay. So now he's going to say, as he began, if you remember, he said, Re'usa Deliba was b'chashoyi, like the avodah of Kahanim, the priests, that they served in silence. And now we're going to see the difference, why one is with silence and one is with sound. Ulechein, continuing. But Re'usa Deliba, in the first form of stimulation and awakening, called Re'usa Deliba, the desire of the heart, Shesibasa hu mitzad hakiruv, and the cause there is due to feeling closeness. V'inyanahu gam ken in hakiruv, and it's inyan, like he said, not just the cause, but its very essence. It's about becoming kiruv, becoming encompassed and closer to the thing that you're desiring. In this case, godliness. Let me just see the footnote, what they say there. Okay. Harihu b'chashai. That is experienced through silence. Doesn't make any sound. It's a silent experience. Ubetshuva liyesa min harichuk dafka. By contrast, tshuva, which in this case we're talking about shofar, Being that it comes from the richuk, from a sense of distance, and the distress involved with that feeling distant, and that's why it's with a cry and with a seamless call or sound, dafke. Now he's going to explain a bit more about sound in a moment, but let's just understand why he's saying what he's saying here. In general, for example, one example given in other places, when you light a log in a fireplace, right? If the log is wet or moist, or it's not really dry and completely ready for fire, what's going to happen is going to crackle. It's going to make noise. When a log is completely dry, and it's very conducive to capture the flame, you'll see it burns silently. Why is that the case? Because whenever you're dealing with some resistance, whether it's the moisture in the log, or there may be worms, or whatever it is that is not allowing the log to be completely dry and receptive, so that resistance causes somewhat of a tension, which creates sound. So when a person is in a distressful situation, they're going to cry out that I'm not happy, I'm not in a good place. When I say cry out, obviously there are people who suffer in silence. But we're talking about when you start really feeling it, so you feel the distance, it's going to express itself. Whereas when it's misad kiruv, meaning you're already there, you're just not fully there. You're sensing a closeness, but you want to be completely encompassed. Then it's a silent experience, because you're not dealing with surmara, with avoiding the darkness or avoiding the distance. You're already in the palace, so to speak, but now you want to go all the way into the inner sanctum. And that's why one is with sound, one is silent. So sound, in other words, is dealing with the actual expression of a tension between two paradigms, two realities. Whereas the Re'usa Deliba is in silence. Now we'll see how much he explains this more or not. In other places, in other places in Chassidus, this is discussed more at length. Here, the Rebbe Rashab suffices with this, because remember, at the end of the day, the goal here is to understand Shofar. And of course, as all this will develop, there's a lot of more bigger themes that are going to be unfolding as we continue. But now he's going to continue to explain that even with Shofar and Teshuva, there's also a form of silence. Not everything is always with sound, as we can continue to hear when he talks about the sounds of the Shofar. Now keep in mind, again, this is a Maimer from Rosh Hashanah, the second night of Rosh Hashanah that year, 1905, Tafrei Samach Vov. Okay. So now he continues. The Yesh b'Teshuva Gamkein, in Teshuva itself, we also find Shehi b'Chashay. We also find in Teshuva a silent experience, not always with sound. For who? And he's going to spell out what that means, or in what instance do we find that? When something is really important and vital, very deep inside the person, to the point he doesn't even have the strength, he doesn't have the ability to cry out, because it's so intimately important to him. In other words, the cry itself is already an outer expression, because you're dealing with an outer situation. But there's a situation where so this is a level Chassidus calls the cry of the heart, not Saikas HaKoil. Now, I don't know if you remember, but in Ayin Beis, he's spoken with his one section where he talks about the difference between the cry of the heart and the cry of the sound, of the voice. Like, for example, when you daven, there's supposed to be some sound. But then there's a Saikas HaKoil, the Saikas HaLev, that comes from the innermost heart. So the heart is crying out, but it doesn't express itself in sound. So in Teshuva itself now, he's saying that there's these two levels. Shalamaylam et Saikas HaKoil. So the Saikas HaLev, the cry from the heart, which is higher than the cry of the sound. I just make it a little more palatable before I continue. Just using a psychological example here. It's a negative example, but you probably can find it also in the positive. But it's easier to explain it. You find today, you find in general, when a person, unfortunately, lo yaleinu, and no one should ever know of this, goes through some type of traumatic experience, that's a shock. The initial state of shock is so powerful that they can't even cry. You'll find many times at disaster sites where family is brought and they have all the facilitators and practitioners and therapists to help people process. So it's very vital, they say, the first stage when a person hears, God forbid, again, no one should ever know of this, of some tragedy, there's a certain shock that if it's not dealt with right away, can cause problems later on. What do I mean dealt with? You can't minimize the pain, but it's allowing people to firstly experience it. And initially, you don't even expect someone to cry. They're so shocked that they're completely silent. It's so deep. Now, in the positive end, in Simcha, you probably can also find examples that the joy is so deep, you don't even see it expressed in any way. So I often explain the idea in context of speech and thought. And in general, the same idea here. You find an interesting, strange paradox. When you're asked to talk about nonsense or something superficial, people can talk and talk and talk about the weather, about sports, about off-season sports. I mean, just open up a talk radio, any station, you see they're on and on and on and on. And if you start asking yourself, how important are these matters, you find that most of them are not very relevant to real life. But when it comes to talking about your innermost feelings, ask somebody about their innermost feelings, you'll find most people are very quiet. They have very little to say. How do you explain that? When it comes to something superficial, we should have very little to say. When it comes to your deepest feelings, you should have everything to say. It's all about the most important things that matter to you. And the answer is because speech is like a limited container. It's a limited container. You can only say that much. Liba lepuma legalia, it says. A person cannot express in their lips what's in their heart. That's why often you'll say, I don't really have the words for it. I want to thank you. I love you. I don't really have the adequate words. What are you really saying? You're saying is that the feeling is stronger than any form of expression. And because words are limited containers, they can only express limited amount of energy. That's why humans have created, we have a thing called language of metaphor, like poetry. Metaphor, the containers become larger so they can express something that can be quite contained in usual regular prose. But sometimes metaphor is also not enough. That's why often you'll see an expression like oy vey, or a laugh, or a cry, can express more than entire volumes. Why? Because the intensity of the energy is so powerful that the only way it can express itself is very limited containers. The containers just can't contain so much energy. So the paradox works like this. The more keli, the less oir. The more oir, the less keli. Chassidus actually explains why the body, the human body, which part of the body has concentrated the most faculties and the most prominent faculties in a human being. It's the head. The head has the brain, the vision, sight, sound, speech, smell. Other parts of the body also have the vital organs. There's the heart and so on. But the brain has more concentrated energy than any other part of the body. And yet the brain, the head, is the smallest part of the body. It's less than a third of the body. The torso is much larger. And of course, the legs are around half the body. So Chassidus says, because wherever there's more oir, there's less keli. Wherever there's more keli, there's less oir. It's a klal. It's basically like quantity and quality. Now, in that context, you can understand that there's a level sometimes that's so deep and profound, you can't even express it in metaphor, and not even in a cry, not even in a laugh, not even in a word. And that's the ultimate expression when it's completely silent. Like we say, Koil demama daka, when Eliyahu was waiting for Hashem to appear. So it says, first came a wind. And he thought that's Hashem will be in the wind. He says, "No, le beruach." Then came rash, came a thunder, not berash. Then came an eish, a fire, a lightning, not in lightning. And then came kol de momadaka. Loosely translated, it means a very silent, subtle voice. The mama, like from Daimim, the momadaka, very subtle. Because the deepest expression of things sometimes comes in a very small package, in a very silent way. Yom Kippur is a day of silence. And in that silence lies the deepest intimate experience that we have with Hashem, Yechida. So in general, sound is always already manifesting itself in some form of kelim. And that also explains why Teshuva and Shofar is with sound, because you're dealing with a mokim richuk, like we just learned earlier. So there's a distance. So besides the fact that I said before, the resistance part, there's also the kelim part. Or as Re'usa the Liba is already an intimate experience in the first place, one of closeness. So it's a more silent experience. But now we're saying that in Teshuva itself, you also have two levels. Tzaikas HaKol, the cry of a voice, and Tzaikas HaLev, the cry of the heart. So it's the gei b'primis ad she'ein b'keicha litzek. And that's what it means. You don't have the ability to cry out. Not just because you're so profoundly touched. It's because there's no need for it. And more than that, it's deeper than any cry. Tzaikas halev l'mayla mitzaikas hakol. So now he's going to explain that this explains the other two sounds in the shofar. Remember, tkiya rishena, we said that tkiya is a kol poshet. It's a seamless sound. It's a long sound. Then there's shvarim and there's trua. Shvarim and trua are broken up. One is more staccato. Trua is more staccato, like trua is more do. But they both are broken up by moments of silence. The tkiya is one long sound from beginning to end. The shvarim and the trua are broken up, and he's going to explain what's the difference. What's the difference between the tkiya and the other two sounds? That's v'zeu inyan shvarim v'trua, the tzaikas halev. There, the sound is there. There is a sound, but it's broken up. P'chinas kola p'nima delei yishtama. That breaking up of the sound, that it's not just one long extended sound, reflects the inner voice, but the delei yishtama, that's not heard. Basically, the soundless voice. And he brings on that, I think it's a Zohar, yeah. The Zohar talks about that. Now you can say, 1 second, there is sound. It's not completely silent. However, as Chassidus explains here and other places, the fact that it's broken up means that you're already introducing some silence into it as well. It's sound with spurts of silence. Or you could say spurts of sound with silence in between. Then there is a level of no sound at all. But here he wants to say the difference between tekiya is a sound that doesn't stop from beginning to the end, from when the one who's blowing and sounding the shofar, the tekiya is supposed to be extended, not broken up at all. Because it's expressing more of the world of tshuva through sound, tzaikas hakol. And shvarim and trua, because of the breakup reflects also an element that is beyond sound. Ki yadua umavur b'mokem acher, as it's known, explained elsewhere. So there's a whole bunch of sources on footnote 23. So if you really want more about this, and there's a lot more about this, here you have at least 10 different sources here, maybe even more. The Siddur, Teres Reish. So when we were learning it in Ayin Beis, we didn't have it with footnotes. So I would often present sources and sometimes explain things based on those sources. Some of what I said is based on some of these sources. But if anyone wants to look further into this, by all means. It just, we do have limits. I can't go into every mimer on this topic because we have a lot to cover here. Our focus is Samach Vav here. But every piece in Chassidus is going to touch upon other overlap with other themes and that are discussed elsewhere more at length. And if you really want to get the whole picture, yes, it's worthwhile looking if you're interested in understanding the difference, the three different sounds. He doesn't go into the difference between Trua and Shvarim and Trua here. He may do that later. I don't remember now. I don't think so. But in those Maimorim, he does discuss it more in detail. Okay, let me stop for any questions.
Rabbi, I just wanted to, as an aside from this, because we're in the month of Cheshvan, give it based on the concept of silence and speaking. I know that the word Cheshvan is connected to Chashmal, and I'm wondering if there is any connection to that word in regards to what we're learning in Samach Vav and silence, and how that connects to the Shofar, maybe on the three levels of like, I know it's not directly in there, but I'm trying to apply it somehow.
Yeah, I understand. So I don't know if you're joined the class now for the first time, but generally speaking, I try to avoid.
Cheshvan is connected to Chashmal.
Right.
Where? In which place is it saying?
He's asking a question whether there's a connection.
So I'm asking a general question. I'm just trying to relate. I know I've been in the
I'm going to respond.
Okay.
Let me respond. So in this class, I try all the time to stick to what we're learning here, because everybody here in this class has, I'm sure, learned other themes. And when you start going into other topics, you could really go off on tangents. So I avoid that. What I would say to you is that there are good books to look up, namely Sefer Lekutim, I often quote, of the Tzemach Tzedek. It's an encyclopedia. And if you look up Chashmal in that entry, or you can use AI today and search, and you can find plenty of connections. There are connections, but since the Rebbe Rashab doesn't make them here, I'd rather not go into it right here and keep focused what we're learning right here. So my answer shortly is yes, there is a connection, but if you want more details, and especially you want to connect it to Cheshvan and so on, I would suggest looking up those sources. You could also contact, either you can write us an email, and I may respond to it at My Life or other places, but I want to focus here on Samach Vav, because as you can imagine, that if everybody here begins to bring all the different things they know, we're going to really be talking about all kinds of other topics. And I try to just stick to the plot, so to speak.
Understood completely. I appreciate it.
So, and if you need help with that, just if you're on the WhatsApp group, just write, does anybody know how to find something about Chashmal? Remember, study is not just in this class. You can always do it offline afterwards. That's why we have a group. And feel free. I'm saying this not just to you, but to everyone. If there's a question that's on your mind that, for whatever reason, is not addressed directly here, feel free to add. There's almost 100 people on this group, maybe more now, and people will be able to help with each other, and we can find things. And obviously, if I have something that I can easily refer to, I'll refer to it as well.
Baruch Hashem, thank you so much.
Yeah. Chashmal is a subject in the Gemara Gige, and it talks about what exactly that word means, and it has the context of silence there as well. So, with that said, are there any other questions?
I think Chashmal is a combination of silence.
Yeah, but that's what we said.
Talking.
That's why I'm not going to discuss it now. I told you where to look, and that's that. Yeah. Nimtza. So what do we derive from all this? Rebbe Rashab is summing up now what we have learned till here. The Shofar Inyan Tshuva. The bottom line, he began that Shofar, the sound of the Shofar is Tshuva. In Tshuva itself, we have the Kel Poshet, the long call and sound of the Tkiyah, and we have the shorter calls of the Shvarim and the Trua. But overall, the Shofar is Tshuva. That's where he began. You go back, beginning of the paragraph in the previous page, it's coming to explain Shofar. Inyan HaTshuva. U'kamei shekosav Rambam, Hilchos Tshuva, Perek Gimel Halacha Daled, like the Rambam writes, and he gives us the direct source. In the Laws of Tshuva, chapter 3, Halacha Daled, V'zel Sheinek, and he quotes, he cites it. Afal Pishat Kiyah Shofar b'Rosh Hashanah Gzeres HaKosov, I mentioned it yesterday. Even though Rosh Hashanah, the sounding of the shofar Rosh Hashanah is Gzeres HaKosov. The Torah doesn't tell us why we sound the shofar. It says it comes Tikka b'cheder shefer. That's actually not from the pasuk. That's in Tehillim, but talks about that in the 7th month on the first day. He says sound the shofar. It's Gzeres HaKosov. Gzeres HaKosov means a decree of the verse of the Torah. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, remez yesh boi. Nevertheless, it alludes to something. In other words, there is a remez that you can derive. What does the shofar represent? The Rapsadi Goyen actually gives 10 reasons why we sound the shofar. But the pasuk, it's Gzeres HaKosov. The Rambam brings a remez. And what's the remez? Koloimer, it comes to tell us. Koloimer, what is the remez? That the shofar represents Uru Yesheni Mishinaschem. Wake up those that are asleep from your slumber, from your sleep. In other words, the shofar is a wake-up call. And be introspective and essentially soul-search in your actions. So it's a wake-up call. The shofar is like a cry, like an alarm clock that wakes you up to become introspective and look inside your bechipshu, meaning evaluate, be accountable for your actions. V'chozru b'tshuva, and return with tshuva. So clearly the Rambam is saying, v'zichru beirachem, and remember your Creator. It continues. Let me finish the whole lashon of the Rambam, then we'll go back on. So who's it referring to? The Rambam says, Elu hasheikhim es ha'emes b'havle hazman. We're talking about those who forgot the truth due to the vanity or due to the wasted time where they're involved in superficial matters or petty matters. Havle hazman. People busy with life's surface level things. So the Torah is telling us, blow shofar, what's the remez? To wake people up from their sleep. What sleep? Talk about a spiritual sleep, an emotional sleep. Hibitu lenafshesechem. The Rambam continues. Hibitu from the word like gaze. Gaze into your soul, into your souls. Vehitivu darchechem. And improve your ways. So it's a whole series of steps here he talks about. Waking people up from their sleep, introspection in their actions, returning in tshuva, remembering their Creator. For those that have forgotten the emes due to their whatever distractions they have in their lives, gaze into your souls, and improve your ways. Let me just see now. The Rebbe Rashab now, in a parenthesis that is going to go, I want to see how long this parenthesis is. Looks quite long. To the next page. He's going to explain what these three things, the Rambam, why is the Rambam mentioning all these different expressions? It's not just being poetic and redundant. They all reflect different levels. So let me just see here. Yeah. This parenthesis that he's going to go now goes all the way, just a moment.
Eighth line down on the next page that begins Torah.
So so there's a parenthesis within the parentheses. So this parenthesis is going to go to the second line from the end of the next paragraph on page 3. But I'm going to skip the parentheses for a moment. I just want to go back to so what do we see from the Rambam? The main thing you want to see from the Rambam is that shofar is connected to tshuva. So even though it's Gzeres HaKosov, the Rambam clearly says it's a remez to tshuva. So after the parentheses, I'm just skipping the parentheses for a moment. I'm going to go back to it in a moment. It says, V'zeu klolesinya mitzvah shofar. This is finishing after the Rambam's citation from the Rambam and the Rebbe Rashab's explanation. Says this is the general idea of the mitzvah of shofar. Shu mitzvahs hatshuva shalamayla mikol mitzvahs. It's the mitzvah of tshuva that's higher than all the mitzvahs. And with that, he concludes the paragraph on page 3. Okay. I'm going to go back to the parentheses. This is some of the ways sometimes we learn, parentheses can be a long parentheses, and I don't want it to become a distraction. So sometimes I'll just skip the parentheses and just go to the next section. But here we can go right back to the parentheses. But the point is, just keep in mind where we are now, that the shofar that he spoke about, that we don't blow on Shabbos, to understand that, he said, let's first understand what shofar is. Shofar is tshuva, in one word. And he discussed what tshuva means, the cry from inside, within, cry of the sound, the cry of the cry of the voice, cry of the heart. And the Rambam clearly states it explicitly. That is the remes to tshuva. In the parentheses now, he's going to explain the Rambam. He's going to analyze some of the expressions of the Rambam according to Chassidus. So let's go back now to the parentheses. The parentheses is v'yesh leimer. So yesh leimer is a common expression in the Maimorim of Chassidus when the Rebbe is coming to add something. Yesh leimer means, and you can say, no, it's his chiddush. He is adding interpretation here. In this case, he's adding an interpretation in the Rambam. Yesh leimer shemerames, that the Rambam is alluding to Gimel Inyanim. The Rambam, when he brings these quotes, it's not just, as I said, nice phraseology, but he's actually hinting to three things that are fundamental to Rosh Hashanah. And these are the Malchias, Zechrenis, Shefris. So, in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, when it talks about what we say, the prayers of Rosh Hashanah, it says we add special 9 particular blessings or prayers. And they're called Malchias, Zechrenis, and Shefris. We say it especially, you find it throughout the davening Rosh Hashanah, but especially in Musaf, you'll see when the Musaf prayer, when they blow the shofar, when it's not Shabbos, of course. So there's this 3 times they blow the shofar throughout Musaf in the Amidah, both when we say it and then when the Chazan repeats it. And those follow the psukim of Malchus, Zechrein, Shefris. Malchus means we cite verses that talk about crowning God as king, Melech. Zechrenis is verses that describe how God remembers us. And finally, Shefris is psukim that talk about Shofar. Like how you talk about Shofar Gadol, or the Shofar by Matan Torah, and so on. So these are 3 elements that are fundamental to Rosh Hashanah. Actually, in Ayin Beis, he's going to explain all the way to the end of Ayin Beis. He goes back to the Malchus, Zechrein, and Shefris. So this parenthesis, though right now it's more of a parenthetical piece, in the Rambam, it actually is going to connect to the central theme of Samach Vav. And I'll just briefly say that Malchus, Zechrein, and Shefris is Mamala Kol Almin, Seviv Kol Almin, and Atzmus. But he's connecting it now to the Rambam. And here's what he says. The Mashikosav, what the Rambam says, Uri Yeshenim, that those that are asleep, wake up. V'chipshu b'masechem, v'chazur b'tshuva, 3 things, he said. Wake up from sleep, evaluate, or chipsu, evaluate your actions, and return to tshuva, ze'inyin malchis. That group of 3, that refers to malchis. Why? Because on a simple explanation, on a very simple basis, on a sin and a transgression, when a person, God forbid, sins, what have they done? They've transgressed and broken the command of the king, in this case, Malchus Shalelam, the Eibishter. He's the king of the world. The king gave us an order called the mitzvahs. When a person transgresses, they have transgressed the will and the command of the king. That is called, defying the king is a form of
rebellion.
Rebellion is another word that I want.
Revolt.
Mutiny. So this is a mutiny in Malchus. So we know Merida b'Malchus is when someone rebels against the king, it's a serious infraction. Rahman al-Islam, he says, heaven forbid. So what's the tikkun? What's the tikkun for this? V'atikun lezeh hu b'kabolas el malchus yizbarach. The repair is to renew the connection and the commitment, kabolas el malchus yizbarach, accepting the yoke of the Eibishter's kingship over you, God's sovereignty. Lias Mosr LaHashem u'l'rtzeni yizbarach, to be committed to Hashem and to His will. V'zeu inyan hatshuva de Rosh Hashanah, and that is the tshuva of Rosh Hashanah. That we look into our lives, we evaluate, as the Rambam says, we look at our actions, we wake up from the sleep, and we return through tshuva. So essentially, it's an accepting of God's malchus. So that goes in the category of malchus. Shemischaret ma'ed, that he very much has remorse and regret. Umismarmer benafshe, and feels bitterness and pain in his spirit. Ala richuk, remember the richuk he spoke about before, the distance that was caused by his transgressions. Shenisrachik, that he was distanced. V'shov el havaya b'chol libei, and he returns to Hashem with his entire heart. Lies moser umeshubed elov levadei, to be completely dedicated and subjugated to Him alone, to God alone. L'kayim ritzeni yizbarach, to fulfill His will and desire. So that's the essence of Teshuva Rosh Hashanah. Person looks at they look into their own lives. They do the soul searching we're talking about, an introspection, and makes that commitment to the Malchus Yizbarach. V'yadua, and it's known, the Ikar HaTshuva hu ala yira dafke. So now he makes a new statement here. Again, the sources are all below. They're very copious and very detailed. So for the record, Ayin Beis is being published now also with the sources. Hasn't been finished yet, but it's the middle. So the sources will give you more information on anything here that's discussed. So he says now another point. It's known that primary tshuva is on yira. There's ava and yira. We know there's two mitzvahs that are mitzvahs klolis. They encompass all the other mitzvahs. Loving God, that's kiruv. Yiras Hashem is richuk. Loving God meaning feeling intimate, feeling close. Like Re'usa the Liba that we spoke about before. Yira is feeling reverence, awe, a distance. Now, distance can come from feeling that you're distant, but it also recognizes that God is beyond us. So he says, Tshuva is ala yira dafke. Tshuva is specifically on yira. Now, he's not getting into what was asked yesterday about Tshuva Tata, Tshuva Ilah. Talking about Tshuva in general. Yira. Shazeu behechrich sheyeh b'chinas avedus eved. So again, these are themes that are going to be discussed later in Ayin Beis, and I see the Rebbe Rashab is already hinting to them here. The Aved of the Eved talked about self-generated Aved b'koyach atzmei. He's going to talk later that is the work of the Eved, as a contrast to a ben, to a son. An Eved is primarily, Eved means Aved. Eved is a servant. So what are we talking about? A servant to a melech. So the idea of subjugation, the idea of bittul to the melech, is Avedis Eved, and that's primarily Yira. The Eved does not have to love his master. The Eved has to be reverent and respect him and listen to what he says. It doesn't hurt to love, and love is an important thing. But the primary thing, that you must have Yira to be in the state of an Eved. Like a son, even though it says, as Ovev v'Imav Tiro, there's also an element of revering and respecting parents, but a son has a closeness to a father, and that's why Yira is harder there. But an Eved is primarily Yira. And it's dafka when a person is in that place, that's where you're shaykh asking for forgiveness. If a person's just close with you, in a way they, I don't want to say take for granted, but they don't have the full respect and reverence, there won't be the bakosha. Bakosha slicha is you feel you've transgressed and done something that defied God's will, and now, out of yira, out of that reverence, you come and ask for forgiveness. So this is a mimer from the Rebbe Marash, Samach Tzedek's, I'm sorry, the Rebbe Rashab's father. In the mimer Kimcha Slicha Tofresh Lamed Daled is the equivalent of, that would be 1873. So below they tell you what page. The footnote 26 it tells you where. Okay. So all this is coming to explain the Rambam that the three expressions are all Malchus. The Etzem Minyan Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim the Rosh Hashanah. Next page, 3. And the very core idea of accepting the yoke of heaven on Rosh Hashanah ain't a daimel Kabbalah Shel the Chol Hashanah. It's not similar to the Kabbalah Shel all year round. A person has to always be dedicated and committed to God, the King. But it's not comparable. Why? All year round, it's only Kabbalah Shel alone, meaning on the basic level, that a person is simply completely dedicated to God. He doesn't, which is below all the faculties, meaning he's not using his wisdom and intelligence or his emotions. It's lower than the internal faculties. I'll explain this more in a moment. The Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim the Rosh Hashanah, by contrast, hu b'chinas primius ve'atzmus nafshei. The Kabbalah Shel Malchus Shamayim Rosh Hashanah is the inner and core of the nefesh, like we learned before, because Rosh Hashanah reaches the inner core. So now you see here in Kabbalah Shel itself, which means in year, there are also two levels. There's just basic, for example, a servant who's just following what the master says, what his king says, do this, do that. But then you can have a Kabbalah Shel like of the ministers and the ambassadors who have a profound intelligence and understand the king, and yet they, from the inner part of themselves, are dedicated. It's a far different level of dedication. Like discussed elsewhere. I believe later also in Samach Vav is going to discuss this. So this explains all year round the Kabbalah Shel is not necessarily associated with tshuva. There it's associated with commitment. Whereas when it comes from what he calls here pnimis ve'atzmus, it's like tshuva. Tshuva is, of course, that return, like he said before, the yearning and longing to connect. And that's the Kabbalah Shel of Rosh Hashanah. Why he's bringing the difference between all year round and Rosh Hashanah, I don't know if it's related to the Rambam, which the parentheses came to explain. It could be the Rebbe Rashab is just adding that, just for good measure, so to speak, since he's talking about Kabbalah Shel, wants to explain the difference between Rosh Hashanah and the rest of the year. Maybe this will become clearer later why he's adding that, but he does add that. Okay, but he didn't finish with the Rambam. Let's try to finish this whole parentheses here. Let me see if I can get through it all. So that's the first part of the Rambam. The first three phrases are what? He said, waking up Uri Yeshenim. The second is to look, Chipshu B'Maseichem, introspection and looking into evaluating your actions, and Chazru B'Tshuva, and V'zich, one second. The Chazru B'Tshuva, all this goes in Malchus. But then the Rambam continues, and he says, the Rambam then says, and remember your Creator. Hu inyan zechrenis. That's hinting to zechrenis. Da zekaron lamayla hu ha'idei shezecher es Hashem tomid ve'ena shecheach es ha'emes. It's interesting here. Zechrenis often refers to God remembering us, but here he's turning it around and saying that it's referring to us remembering God. But he calls it zikaron lamayla. So I need to look into that a bit more, what he means here. The zikaron lamayla is through remembering Hashem constantly, ve'ena shecheach es ha'emes, and does not forget the truth. I need to look up, there's an explanation on this from the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe, that's printed in the back of the Sefer. I'm going to look at it later, and I'll fill you in once I do a little more research. But basically, the word zichru is what the Rebbe Rashab is focusing on. So this is zichrenis after Malchus. v'yeshlemer, parentheses within the parentheses, and we can say the Kabbalah shel Malchus Shamayim is ein b'zeh inyan hasoge v'hergish prati. Distinguishing between the first part of the Rambam and this, what does the Zichru come to add? Remembering your Creator. It says, because Kabbalah shel Malchus Shamayim, the first section, Malchius, there you don't have a specific comprehension and feeling. Hasoge v'hergish prati. There it's more of a dedication and commitment to God. But Zechrenis, who laid us Havaya. Zechrenis is, when you say remembering, means you're knowing. It's not just a commitment, it's awareness and a perception of God. Bechinas ve'emes Hashem le'elam. The opposite of sheker. Like he said before, shecheches emes. Someone who forgets the truth, here you're remembering that God, the truth of God, the eternal truth of God. So here it's already getting into understanding, appreciating how Havaya and Elikim are all one, meaning the transcendent level of the divine, Havaya, is one with the immanent level of Elikus within existence, Ukadema, and similar. So now Zechrenis is already a form of contemplation that your mind is understanding and Zichru, remembering and perceiving godliness. So the difference between Shomer and Zachar, but we say by Shabbos, Shomer is feminine, Zachar is masculine. So in Chassidus it explains it's two different levels. So Kabbalah Sale is Shomer, meaning you're like making sure that you're following what God wants. Zachar is remembering an awareness that's more than that. You see, I see in the footnote he also brings here. Let's see. 32, what does he say? Okay, it's from Isaiah, good. And then finally, the last piece of the Rambam, or Mashakosav, the Rambam, he bitul nafshesechem, ve'tivu darchechem, gaze into your souls and improve your path, your ways, hu inyan shefris. That's the third thing. Malchus, Zechrenis, comes Shefris. Shemavur Sham Inyan Matan Teda, Shaya Bekel Shefer. Because in Shefris it talks about Matan Teda, where there was a Kel Shefer, the sound of the Shefer. The Oz Nischayvu Bekim Ateda Mitzvahs. Then by Matan Teda, when the sound of the Shefer, that's is when they were obligated in the performance of mitzvahs. Now here he doesn't explain details, like why is it connected to hibitu, gazing into the soul, your souls, and hitivu darchechem. But clearly it's a higher level that follows the first two. So the first one is Kabbalah Sel Malchus Shamayim Malchus. It's accepting God's sovereignty in a profound way, like Rosh Hashanah manner, not just all year round Kabbalah Sel. The second is you're using your faculties, the mind, to remember and perceive and appreciate and understand godliness. And the third, clearly, is going deeper into commitment. That's the Shefer, that is soul-searching, Hebitul Nafshesechem, gazing into the souls and improving your ways. Why is Hitiva Darchechem more powerful than Tshuva in the beginning of the Rambam, piece of the Rambam? Needs more explanation. I would have to look into it some more. But this is what the Rebbe Rashab says here. And I believe that at the end of the Hemshech, he goes back to these three things and discusses them. I see in the footnote they also cite that. At the bottom of page, they write, bottom of page 709 and on. I'm going to look it up and see what I find. But that concludes the parentheses that explains the three expressions in the Rambam, the three phrases, the three sections in the Rambam, Malchus, Zechrenis, Shefris, and then, as we already finished after the parentheses, all going back to the main point that Shofar is Tshuva. That's higher than all the mitzvahs. That's what Shofar is in overall. But there's a breakdown of these three different levels in that itself. And as I said, this is setting the stage for later discussion about these three levels, which we'll talk about at length, especially as we get later into the Hemshech. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, the end of the paragraph on page 3, Gimel. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Okay.
Why does the Rebbe Rashab distinguish the matter of Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shemayim between something particular versus something general? Ein b'zeinyan hasaga v'hergish prati ke'im hanasina v'amsira l'Hashem.
He's explaining what the Chrenos adds to Malchus. So Malchus is the acceptance, the commitment. Zechrenos is remembering and understanding, perceiving God. So that's why he's saying it's only a general. It doesn't have any particular comprehension and feeling. It's an overall commitment.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's it. Any other questions? No, we'll stop here. Again, the end of the paragraph on page 3. Moving along. And again, anyone wants to participate and join in the WhatsApp. We have a special Samach Vov WhatsApp group where we review, or there are different things posted there. Also schedule changes if there are any. And you could add any of your questions if you have there. Please let us know your number and name, and we'll be happy to add you. And overall, samachvav.com, samachvav.com, which is part of chassidussupply.com, is a full landing page where you can find now Samach Vav resources, including a summary of all these discourses, as well as different themes, as well as they'll also now begin the playlist that began yesterday. So now all these Samach Vav videos you can find right there. So if you're listening to this, you just go to that page and you can find that the videos will be listed in order. So if you ever want to go back to watch or listen to any of these classes, you can do so easily forever, because it's permanently stored there. So with that,
thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. I will end the